I guess you can all guess at the theme of the class tonight. We dealt with the easy problem in this last retreat, death. The hard problem is loneliness. The root of all suffering in the ego is loneliness. If you trace back all of your defense mechanisms, all your addictions, all your craziness, it comes down to an avoidance of loneliness, doesn't it? Or an acceptance of loneliness, but a bitter acceptance, a Vulcan acceptance. Stoic resignation to the lonely life. So people can't handle it. And because they can't handle it, they refuse to grow up, because growing up means facing your loneliness, doesn't it? And so people do all kinds of things to avoid it. They drink alcohol, that's a big one, or they stuff their loneliness with pizza or other comfort foods, or other harder drugs, or promiscuity, or various other ways of dealing with it, porn, and all of the ways that people try to have imaginary kind of flings or assumptions of a coupling that usually falls flat. Often the best choice for a neurotic ego is to fall in love with their pet. And then you have somebody who it won't leave you probably and doesn't talk back and tell you that they hate you, actually, see. So there are all these different ways, but they all lead to a kind of a codependency, and they come down to a refusal to grow up. Because growing up means facing solitude. So the only cure, the one and only cure for loneliness is onlyness. And that onlyness means the only one self that is real must be attained. Because the real loneliness that we have is loneliness for our own self. Because the ego is not the self. That's why it's lonely. Now, Jacques Lacan said that the ego is produced by what he called the mirror stage. When the infant first looks in the mirror, recognizes its body, and the mother is usually standing there and says, "That's you." And the baby says, "Oh, that's me." And from then afterwards, the consciousness is trapped in the mirror. Because your consciousness enters a reality tunnel in which you are simply an image of yourself that can be represented in a mirror, but you want it to be a mirror that your mother is looking at. Because she is the one who gave you your identity. And your identity came out of a state of fusion with the mother. I and the mother are one. And when that fusion broke, then you felt abandoned. So most egos think that they have a terrible fear of abandonment. It's not actually a fear of abandonment, because that abandonment already happened in your early childhood, usually at the weaning stage, and the realization that you're born into a relatively loveless world. But because it gets suppressed, you're always throwing that trauma into the future, and then trying to recreate a dosed version of it that you can handle. I can take this loss. Maybe I can take a bigger loss, maybe a bigger one. But there's always a level of loss that you feel you can't take, and then you regress back into an infantile state of consciousness and regress to old habit patterns of avoidance of your only-ness that you interpret as loneliness. And this, of course, creates a whole jungle of projections, the ones you're angry at because they are abandoning you or don't recognize you in that mirror stage and adore you, or the ones that you project on that deserve to be abandoned, etc. And you try to keep yourself as much as possible safe from the taint of the unlovable and the outcast. And of course, there are versions of it where you have to wear a scarlet letter, and there are versions of it where you have to get castrated, you know, and there are versions in which you have to die for your crimes, etc., etc. But all of these narratives get built upon the issue of loneliness. If you go back to the 12th century, that great archetypal story, Tristan and Isolde, look at their names. Triste, sadness. Isolde, isolation, right? The sadness of the isolated ego that would rather take a love potion and get an artificial form of love than to suffer the loneliness of being left out. And so the loneliness of the ego is the issue that the yogi must come to heal and to face and not run away from. But if you think about the tamasic and the rajasic gunas, there are two different ways of trying to escape your loneliness. One is you space out, you get sleepy, or you black out on alcohol or some other way. Or actually, the way that the Pomo deals with the loneliness is to try to cure it not with onlyness, but with onlineness. And if I stay connected often enough and I got somebody trying to call me, I'm okay, you know. But I got to have that phone right there in my pocket. I can cure my loneliness in a minute. Look, I got 25 friends right there, you know. So, these are ways that don't really work very well. And unfortunately, when we've had traumatic childhood situations where the loneliness was augmented by neglect and child abuse, then we tend to even want to repeat those. They repeat in fantasies and nightmares, but they can also repeat in the real of the phenomenal plane, because we prefer to be abused than to be alone. And so the situation of the ego is always a running away from, rajasically, into workaholism or some other, hopefully more productive form of running away, or running away by sleeping one's life away, or spending it on diversions and distractions, or one faces it and goes through it. But that's the black hole that the ego isn't strong enough to confront, and therefore would rather continue its vain fantasies of connections that aren't real, and stay in a Peter Pan type of state rather than to grow beyond the loneliness into the truth of what reality is. But from that needy infant who is trapped in the mirror and whose defense is only narcissism. You see, once it becomes an image, then its only choice is either to let go of that image as it was originally loved and unified with by the mother, who is now the lost object, or It worships that image. It builds shrines to that image. It turns itself into a statue. This is narcissism. But a statue isn't very much alive. It becomes very passive and very unable to grow. And so you have people who are very intelligent but live in a zombie box, because growth means facing that black hole and moving through it. And so there's a difficulty that cannot be overcome by the ego. And it's only by going through ego death that one is cured of this malady. That is, I think now, a universal malady because of the way society was structured that increased the alienation. And now with a lockdown, that alienation is almost total. And you have a massive epidemic of suicide, which is the only way a lot of people have to run away from it. So the loneliness drives people to do things that they later regret, sometimes sooner regret, or don't live to regret. And it's only by facing the fact that the ego itself is loneliness. That's really what it represents, is loss. It represents the death of that initial fusion with the mother that made one feel whole and safe and secure. And so that chakra one security, some people will try to get it through amassing as much money as they can get or other properties. Some people will have as many girlfriends or boyfriends as they can have, or as many connections of whatever kind satisfy the need to not feel need. But none of it works. None of it gets you out of the hell realm and the fragility of the ego that can always fall into that loneliness and feel like it wants to die, can take over and become an irresistible urge that we call the lower death drive. And so the lower three chakras are all bound up in the fear of loneliness, and they're all there to try to escape it. Whether you escape it into drugs or sex or power tripping or violence, everyone has their own chosen avoidance mechanisms, but all of them are lose-lose propositions. And sooner or later one comes to the recognition that the ego, that is the illusion of separation, that the ego itself is a fabrication. It's not what appeared in the mirror, and it's not all the things you were told about yourself, and it's not all the moments of gladness that the ego had, peppered in with all the traumas and neglect and the awfulness of it. There's no way to try to get those little crumbs of jouissance back from the world. And hating the world for the love it didn't give you is not much of a compensation. And the only choice that the rational intelligence has is to die into that black hole of loneliness until the ego itself dissolves and the black hole turns into a white star of blissful, luminous, divine love. And that will happen, but that will only happen if one has the courage to die into that darkness of unknowing. You see, the cloud of unknowing is not about God so much as you're needing to unknow your ego. You need to realize that you never knew yourself and that your ego was always a fake, a construct to deal with the sadness of the loss of love or the never having had it. And that itself needs to die because it was not you. It's a set of emotion-bearing thoughts and images, memories, and projections that keep the patterns of suffering repeating again and again. This is the source of coming back on the wheel of birth and death. We come back in order to be lonely again. And if we want to stop that eternal return of no return and no love and no joy, no fulfillment of what life could offer, we have to recognize that who we are is not that lonely ego. And once you have broken through that, you literally will realize that you were never born, never lost anyone, and that your being is absolute power, love, joy, bliss, wisdom, and eternal awareness untouched by pain, untouched by suffering, untouched by any of those self-images that you fit yourself into and that caused you to grovel in order to get crumbs of love. So self-sovereignty is the refusal to grovel or to fight or to flee or to create constant emotional meltdowns or to waste your life in a vain worship of the ego's self-image, and instead to take the hero's journey through the black hole and die into the real that you are and discover the unborn, uncreated, unlimited, infinite presence, but a presence that is egoless, that is not there to triumph over all of the others that it wants. That's its ultimate fantasy. I will triumph. They will suffer for not having loved me and recognize, right? They will be the ones. No, throwing others into a hell realm is not liberation either. It's just the fantasy that keeps you from liberation. And it's there at a subconscious level. Love and hate are always bound together in the ego. And until all of its fantasies are cut, all of the self-images, positive and negative, all of the fantasies of union and reunion and of control and power, and the rape fantasies and the conquest fantasies that are portrayed in all of these horror films, and you know, the Hannibal Lecters who end up eating the one they love, and now I am one with the mother, you see. All of those fantasies that people do actually live out, hopefully not here, are all efforts to avoid the sadness of a fictional entity that never even existed, but that insists on keeping the fiction alive because it doesn't want the other to get the enjoyment of its demise. And this fantasy structure that controls the narrative of the ego, that adopts either the sadistic or the masochistic role, and that adopts either the coy or the strangling versions of the attempt to overcome its loneliness, and that walks a tightrope of either the total collapse or the total bullying to try to force possessiveness of that lost object, that always ends up in even deeper levels of a sense of loneliness and failure if the ego begins to act out its demand circuit, because its desire circuit has proven hopeless. And so it regresses to a lower level. And then it regresses to an even lower level than that, when that can't be worked out, of a total primitive concreteness that can turn into autism and can turn into psychosis with private hallucinatory others that are able to give you what the world won't give you. But all of these methods, because they are lost causes, and because the ego itself is a lost cause and a hopeless fantasy, must at some point be put to rest, must be allowed to die as peaceful a death as one can manage for it, so that the real self can finally be embodied, and a meaningful life, a life in which one becomes the medium of infinitely important projects, such that the ego could never imagine can be performed by the one self. But otherwise, the ego wastes all of its life energy that is so infinitely precious on projects of complete vanity and insignificance. So this is the only way out that actually works, but it requires a surrender of the ego that is total and complete, to a point that the ego itself cannot imagine doing, because it requires letting go of language, letting go of the thinking project. Because the ego is so terrified of being alone, it never stops thinking, because your thoughts make you not alone. There's a voice talking to me, and you'd rather hear a voice telling you psychotic things or judgmental things or horrible things than to have an empty, silent mind in which you're totally alone with your non-existent self. And until you can tolerate that emptiness, shunyata, you will never find the fullness of the supreme reality that waits for you faithfully, even though you have abandoned that one real self that will always accept you back unconditionally when you finally come home. Namaste. So, the floor is open if any of that made any sense to anyone. Jose, there's a courageous man. Go for it.
Thank you very much. I wanted to be the first one because today my session with Radama was exactly all of what you have said right now.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. I was going to ask you actually if you to talk about my session because
I didn't have a chance to hear this one, but synchronicities are part of the game, aren't they?
Yeah. I was writing a bunch of questions because everything it was what we talked with Radama, and so my question would be the best one that I can, because I have like 10. It would be that when I try to not run away, from that black hole. And I try to silence the mind, and I put myself in a kind of well-eating, no cookies, no tea, water, meditating. Sometimes I can go without eating 2 days, right? And then there comes a point where I crash. I can't keep going. And you see me over there, 20 cookies in a day,
Sure.
things like that.
Right. Okay, you're trying to fight the battle on the anorexic field, right? And trying to have control by not eating. But it's easy to control not eating food. What's not easy to control is not wanting love from the other. And so you crash not because of the food situation, although that's not going to continue. Eventually, that becomes a lethal option as well. But the point is, it's not about that kind of stoic asceticism. It's about simply accepting yourself as you are with that black hole, and then realizing that that is the portal to the liberated self, and go in there and eat the black hole for lunch, not the cookies. And you will be eaten by it, but you'll turn into what remains when it's gone, which is the infinite blissful light. So that's the only solution. Nothing you do on a behavioral level is going to be of any use, except sitting and meditating and silencing the mind.
And how do I find that center or that equilibrium, let's say, because it's easy to eat a lot, and it's also easy to not eat for days.
Sure.
And so
that's what I'm saying. Forget that. You're not the body. What you need to eat is the energy of the real self. Because you don't have any of that, you feel empty, weak, hopeless, because you're disconnected from who you really are. And that fantasy figure of the ego can never be satisfied. It's a hungry ghost. And so, yeah, you can play that game for a long time, but it'll get you nowhere. The point is that you're not the body, and you're not the mind that is in that state of fragility, so that it has to distract itself by playing the fasting game or the eating game. And forget those games. And then sit in the silence of witnessing the discomfort of the sadness of feeling all alone in the world. And if you go through it without reacting to it or trying to fill it with cookies, you will get to a point where it will never again bother you. And then you will be able to know what peace is, and then wisdom, and then bliss. And real power will come to you.
thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked the question, and I'm glad you have the courage to be on this hero's journey. You're going to make it. Tara.
Thank you. I think you were eavesdropping on my session too, after many dreams that seem to relate to this topic. I don't know exactly what my question is, but I just wanted to share that the music has such a familiar vibration. I mean, I grew up on Roy Orbison, and crying over you, and this one.
Yeah, sing. Go ahead. I like that.
And I mean, it was just like blasting out my childhood, these like romantic, sad songs about love and depression. And of course, I entered, as soon as puberty hit, all it was about was romance and breakups and heartaches. And I mean, it was just non-stop my whole life. And how it's like this juiciness as well, even listening to it tonight, there's like the fantasy of the romance. And even though I'm married, it's like there's still that kind of like the love of being in the world and that whole romantic fantasy, and the difference of recognizing, like, if one had been brought up in a vibration of beautiful angelic song where one is looking towards God, not this kind of just mundane sadness about the loss of another. Anyways, I just wanted to kind of mention that yeah, the vibration it has. It's so juicy and so familiar. What do I want to ask beyond that is, I do have a question in here somewhere. Yeah, it just seems impossible to get over. It seems like this ongoing sadness of like wanting this mother's love that, you know, I didn't get, and that's what the dreams are so intense they're showing me recently. And there was this one, without going into too much details of dream, I even like met my twin, you know, and I'm like, you know, I know she's angry with me, and the words are like, just admit it, you're sad that I left you, you know, this kind of like, I left my twin back in England, who you know, that whole fantasy of the romance, and because I was in the family home in this dream, and there's this like fantasy, so I'm kind of going off on a tangent. There's also this like nostalgia I've been having recently, which isn't, and I had a question actually, I was talking to Nirgan about this last night. What even is nostalgia? Because the kind of nostalgia I have is not even like a real, like I even know it's not real. Like I'm fantasizing about some England that doesn't even exist, that I didn't even live. I didn't live in beautiful country home. I lived in like working class, kind of very standard lifestyle. But I have this fantasy of like this romantic England with beautiful country lanes. I didn't even live that life. I might have gone on walks sometimes, but it wasn't even a life I lived. And okay, so I guess my one question would be like the idea of nostalgia. Like, what is, where does it even come from? What does nostalgia? I guess it's a French term, nostalgia.
Well, again, we actually called it with the G, right? The nostalgia of gnosis. Okay, so what is it really? First of all, Heinz Kohut, an American psychologist, invented an approach called self-psychology. And he said that Freud was not exactly accurate in his understanding of the transference, because although it begins with the mother and then it can be projected on the father or someone else, but ultimately it comes down to a twinship transference. You want your twin flame. You want your twin to reflect. It's your mirror image. It's the mirror stage, but I want the twin to tell me she loves me, right? Or he loves me. And to feel whole by merging with that image of the other that is yourself. Now, really what it is the anti-Atman going the other way in time that you really are missing, but you don't know that consciously. So you project it on some illusory twin whose flame is not lit, and they want you to rescue them by lighting your flame, and you don't have one to light, and you want them to do it, and so it never works. But it's the fantasy that keeps the ego going and looking in all the wrong places for a love that it can only find within, because it's yourself that you're missing. But the nostalgia is really for the self that you were before your ego was born, when you were still one with God.
I'll keep looking.
Keep looking, but look inward and upward, not outward.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Kin.
Yes, thank you for this teaching once again.
Is that a wry comment of bittersweet, wishing I hadn't?
Not at all, not at all.
Okay.
Yes, so tonight you spoke about the black hole to go into and the necessity of courage when going into the black hole. But then somehow, well, in my mind, there seems to be another option that you, I believe, also mentioned during the Sat-Prem viewing of using the Kundalini energy going upwards. And so I was wondering about those two. How do those two relate? How does raising one's vibration relate to going into the dark tunnel? Does one need to have a high vibration to go into the tunnel or not? And can someone skip the tunnel and use the raising of the vibration to shoot up the Kundalini? Or can they also both be used in order to create, I don't know, something in the center?
Look, the assemblage point, the third assemblage point, you learned what it's called, right? What do we call it?
I forgot.
Okay, it's called the disillusionment point. Okay, now Melanie Klein, a psychoanalyst, calls it the depressive position. Okay, there's a reason for that, because when you first realize you're never going to get that fantasy met, you get depressed. Okay, and there's a kind of a sadness and remorse, and even a self-blame. You know, if only I had treated my mother better, she would have, you know, or if only I had treated the girlfriend better, or whatever, you know, things would be different. And so the nostalgia and the remorse and the regret and all of that can come together in a fantasy. But eventually you get to the realization that this was inevitable for your ego. And because of the ego's own, let's say, defensiveness against love, it ultimately could not sustain a love relationship of an authentic kind. And it's when you realize your inauthenticity that you finally have a chance to become authentic. Okay? That's when you accept the loss of everything. And this is in other set of music that I was going to play in the next class that come, like Janis Joplin, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose, right? Or the singing in the rain, you know, when everything is lost, but you're still alive and there's consciousness. And if you can accept it and just, you know, move into the darkness of the unknown, somehow magically things will happen that are beautiful, even in the midst of total devastation, if you accept reality on its own terms. And that's what one has to do, that total acceptance of everything life has thrown at you, all of your karma and all of the internal karmic eruptions of the ego's own fantasies. And if you can let all of that die and sing in chakra 4 of total love, because even though you're bereft of everything, you will be able to then rise to that level where the ego dies away and the Vijnanamaya kosha is activated, that body of wisdom that brings you to your archetypal self, that has the energy of divine love built into it. So it's not lacking love, and it's not lacking strength, it's not lacking nobility, even though the ego feels like it's totally unworthy. And you discover that worthy, noble, beautiful self. That's the Arya level of life. And then you can rise to the level of mastery, where the mind is completely put down and transformed, and the mind of God is able to be brought down, as Aurobindo wanted to do. But the problem with Aurobindo is it was his own ego project to get to the supreme and bring it down. It was a Prometheus attempt. And the problem in the West is this archetype of Prometheus. You have a pen over there? It's a dangerous archetype. So I spell it pro-me-theism. Okay? It's an attempt to make a god out of your me and to live in that kind of a narcissistic state. And that won't work. You can't steal the fire of the gods. You're just going to get burned by it. What you've got to do is surrender into that yajna, that sacrificial fire, until you become the fire itself. And that's when life becomes filled with miracles. But the ego has to die for the phoenix to be born out of those flames that has that capacity to fly. And so it's by letting go and surrendering and sacrificing the ego that you get freedom.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. One little question more to add. Is love maintained until that last point? Or must even love be forsaken?
It depends what you mean by love. Because if you mean love in the form of a duality, that I love an object, an other. Even, remember the Sasaki Roshi said, don't make God an object. don't love God as another. That's a sin. If you let go of that form of love, that is a grasping for power from a drowning soul, then that's what you have to let go of and become totally hopeless that you're going to be saved by Christ coming down, you know, or some other messianic image. No, you've got to let all of that go and find the love that is your real being. And that essence then is able to overcome the fear of death because it's deathless and eternal. And that eternal light, when it's lit, then resolves all the darkness of every kind, and one is free.
Thank you.
Priyaji.
Thank you. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about the relation between loneliness and abandonment, because how I've been seeing it before is that loneliness is more a result of abandonment. But what I understand you spoke about today was that abandonment comes much earlier, and then the loneliness was more later connected to the mirror stage. So. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's true. I think what you said, you have been abandoned. You were abandoned long ago. Some people were abandoned even in the womb before they were born because the mother didn't really want them, thought about having an abortion, you know, or the mother wanted one child, but it turned out 2 or 3 were in the uterus, and you know, you weren't one of the ones that the mother was expecting, and actually you were the problem, right? So whatever got projected on you from a very early time, even before actual birth, can be the beginning of loneliness and of abandonment, both. Because abandonment for an infant is death, right? So it's too horrible to contemplate, and because of its unbearable nature, it has to be suppressed. But along with that, you have to suppress a lot of your aliveness and curiosity and your strength, your courage, because you're afraid if you do something wrong, you'll be abandoned. And you'll end up lonely and dead, you see, because you can't handle it. So that fantasy structure then creates a very inhibited personality. And it creates all kinds of karmic consequences. So one has to go through it on the phenomenal plane very often, as well as internally on the mental plane, of letting go of all of the hopes for the fulfillment that whatever fantasies one has kept alive through the years can never be fulfilled, and they have to be finally sacrificed so you can be free to discover the love that is here and is real and that you are entitled to, but that you can't get because you got stuck in an identification with the physical form. Okay? So because you were abandoned, loneliness is structured into the ego. And it always is going to predict that it will be abandoned, and then of course that happens. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And even if one isn't physically abandoned, one will feel emotionally abandoned, and that the relationship is loveless and empty. And then there'll be a mutual abandonment. Most marriages are a state of mutual abandonment and mutual torment combined. But you know, love mostly drops away at an early phase. So the situation is inherent to the ego, both of those. Abandonment, both as a victim and as the one who abandons in order not to be abandoned, and the loneliness that is always there no matter what you do. Okay. Ashoka.
I have 2 questions. First, I find that my ego is terrified of being happy.
Because?
Well, because it requires me to come alive.
Mm-hmm.
It requires me to be honest with myself.
Mm-hmm.
And
what's the danger if you come alive?
I have to let go of the child that wants to stay depressed.
Yes. And irresponsible.
Yes.
Right? And in its fantasy of some fusion that isn't real. Yeah. So it's a refusal to grow up, because that would mean facing that loneliness. And coming alive fully would mean you could die. Right? It means accepting the mortality of life. And if you never come alive, you can never be killed, you see? And so if you never have that love, you can never lose it. And so you don't have to face the sadness of that. But you're paying a big price for taking the easy way out, which is, going to keep you from ever knowing what full aliveness is and what you were capable of if you'd let out all the stops. You don't want to miss out on knowing that.
Okay, so second question.
Okay.
No, it's true. I don't want to, I don't want at the end of my life realize that all I did was squander it.
Yes.
That would be super painful.
Yes, so you answered your second question. Why wait? Come alive now.
So what I think is the black hole, I find it, there's a lot of, if I go into that pain, let's say, it's like there's a burning and there's pain, but there's also redemption in it. And so sometimes, or when I'm able to touch into that, the mind, because there is redemption, because there is a sense of relief, it almost becomes uplifting.
Not almost, it is.
And then the mind says, is this Jewish songs? Because I'm feeling both pain and this upliftment at the same time.
No, but this is not. Because the pain is the letting go of the ego and feeling all the pain that you had been carrying, but the redemption is that you're letting it die. You're burning it in the fire of sacrifice, and you will be free. But see, at the last minute, you say, oh no, it's jouissance, I can't do it. And then you fool yourself with a self-deceptive thought. You see how clever the ego is? That's not jouissance, but that'll make you then go into real jouissance and justify it and say, well, that was a close call. I almost went through ego, death, and liberation. Wow, I don't want to get too close to that again, right? So yes, that's what the ego will do. You have to outsmart it. All right.
Thank you.
You're going to make it too, very soon. You're not going to squander any more life. Anyone else? Lakshmi?
I had a question, perhaps in another direction of this loneliness. It seems to me that there's also a fear of the ego, of becoming so different in this ascension, in this paradigm-shifting understanding of reality that is gained and lost and gained and lost every time one ascends, that there might be this conscious or unconscious, sometimes I feel it's conscious, other times I feel it's unconscious, fear of being so totally different from everything and everyone and everything you know, not just people.
That you'll be totally lonely.
That the loneliness that is felt
Exactly.
is so intense and so
Yes.
I don't know, overwhelming that then there's
That's right.
a reaction to it. So I
Yeah,
wanted
of
to
course.
ask you, yeah.
Because that's what this process is. It's differentiation from everyone else and individuation, means you become totally different, totally unknowable and unreachable by anyone. No one will understand you, at least not those who are in the ego and in the herd mentality, no. But do you really care? Do you really want to go back to a boring conversation with somebody who is doing small talk and is totally clueless as to reality? No, be glad that you're liberated from having attachments to other people. You have to shift your values and value your solitude, because that's how you achieve something in life, right? When you're alone, you have time, that's when you create. But if you're lonely, you're not going to create anything important. You're going to go online and you're going to run away and you're going to try to talk to people from the past, right? And you're going to do all those things that will bring you back down to a lower state. So yes, you have to accept that your onlyness within the loneliness can only be satisfied by union with God, not by relations with human others who are only fictional entities anyway.
Yeah, I think I am aware of that when it comes up. But maybe my question is, there seems to still be an unconscious.
Because you don't want it to be conscious.
Okay, so what would you recommend in the?
You sit in it without moving from it, without acting on it, without running away from it. You sit in that feeling, and it will all come up consciously. And it'll bring with it all the loneliness that is too unbearable to be conscious. And if you can sit in it and not get so sad that you have to eat a piece of chocolate or, run around the loop or do something to get away from the feeling, if you can sit through it, it will dissolve. And with it, your ego, that is the one that needs that, will also die, and you'll be reborn.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Marjivama.
On the question of onlyness, I'm reflecting on that step out of loneliness to onlyness, and relating to it, and perhaps you can flesh it out for me some more. In that discernment, one recognizes that the otherness is always a projection. And so it's that dream, understanding the either the hate or the desire that's being projected on another to keep that loneliness at bay, is only you.
Yes.
And in that aha, it's it's only you. And it seems to me that in this process that I've been experimenting with, this shift of recognizing that it is the play is being characterized with aspects of consciousness that are lonely and need to be taken in.
Sure.
So they're not projected out anymore. And in this process of taking it all in, and I think in that solitude perhaps that you were describing, and sitting with it, there's that act of meditation, of that purification, of that aspect of consciousness, is where I feel the real work has taken place. And I also noticed that it took me, I don't know how many years of our classes, of our sessions, to shift even my questions or my curiosity from what is loneliness and how can I do, that from within the egos play with loneliness to the only-ness. And noticing that even though your teachings, for example, are so clear about it's only love of God, love of yourself, love of the Atman, it's going to get you there. The entire time then discussing the teachings, or pretty much, are focused about the ego part. And so this shift in which I've noticed in this own process, it took years and years to eat through the ego's hold on consciousness, or the identification to it that held on to it. And even now, I'm not there yet. And I'm still grappling with taking in whatever I feel there are projections going out, just absorbing them back in and sitting in it. And if it takes 4 hours of meditation until there's okay, that's what it was, that's that fragment within. And then only the power of that higher love, of divine love, can actually contain it and integrate it. And raise it in that perhaps Kundalini ascension upward. So this step into the only-ness, I guess is my question, where I can see this and I can absorb it back in, and yet not fully.
Sure.
Okay,
what takes it? That's a very good question, very, very deep one, a very important one, and shows how far you've gotten in the process, which is beautiful. But the postmodern ego is structured with a dissociated identity disorder. In other words, it's fragmented into so many little pieces, each with a different identity and a different attitude and a different self-image and different desires and fears, etc. They can't meet. And so you're going to be in one of those fragments at a time, and the rest of them are going to be projected as your world. And some of those dark fragments, you're going to be worried about other people's projections on you, not your projections on them, even though it is your projection that caused that to happen. So you have to recognize that the whole world is your dream field, and everyone in it is a part of the same self. Okay, and there are not many, so you don't need to be paranoid or desirous or whatever other attitude each fragment might have, because all of it is yourself. And the moment you can recognize that, you can let go of all of the fear that you blew it with this one, or you shouldn't have said that to the other one, or whatever, all of those things that the mind obsesses about, because they're all just parts of yourself that you're not able to love, right? So when you let go of any identification with any of the fragments and you become the container of all of them and can accept all of them unconditionally, that's when they'll be unified. And not only will the projections of the ego be healed and united into a point, but there won't even be a world left. That's why Ramana said in the Ajatavada, that final stage, no world, nothing was ever created. This is all a dream, and even the dream didn't really get dreamed, you see. It's just information. And that information, when it's all united, is infinite intelligence and love and joy. And that's really what you are. But that process of fully coagulating into the one point of the zero, Shiv, is not yet fully attained. But as you get closer to it, the magnetic draw toward that unity will get stronger, and the repellent force will get weaker. But there's a centrifugal and a centripetal energy that oscillates, systole, diastole, right? But the more that you get close, soon there'll be a gravitational pull and union, and then they'll never split again. Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes left if there's... Okay, Anandi.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up with Mahalakshmi's question, and you said sit with it or sit in it, the feeling of loneliness. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit how to sit in something and not being like the ego is feeling pity about oneself, or
It will.
just emotional, or
It's going to do all of that.
but going really, or not spacing out and so just sitting in a kind of, I don't know, suspended animation or...
No, you can't even suspend it. You don't have the power to do that. In a way, it is suspended because you're not fully alive because of all of these thoughts. But all you can do, and all that you need to do, is witness it. That's all you can do. Witness it without identifying with those thoughts. You have to extract your consciousness from identification with those lonely ideas and the paranoid ideas and the angry ideas. All of that comes from the loneliness. If you can extract it and see that they're fictional, they have no reality. This is a nightmare you've created yourself and you're trapped in and you have to awaken from. You can't get out of it by doing something because the one who's doing is the one in the nightmare. You have to realize your whole life is that nightmare, and you, the real you, was never born. You don't exist. You are emptiness. And if you sit in that emptiness and witness it without identifying, then the nightmare can be transformed into something beautiful. But first you have to totally accept it and the horror of it, the absolute horror of being an ego, and realizing that you're not an ego, but you thought you were just ignorant of who you really are. And the ignorance is only cured through silent witnessing without reacting to the emotions or the thoughts. And then they will dissolve in the fire of your concentration that can witness it. That is what burns it up. And that's why people don't meditate. They fall asleep or they do something else because they actually don't want to burn up their misery. They want to keep it going because they're afraid, more than they're afraid of the horror of the ego, is the horror of not having an ego and being nothingness. And so if you can get over the fear of nothingness, because that's what you are anyway, then that nothingness becomes the fullness of God's presence. And that's all you ever really were or shall be. Kalki.
Thank you. In my case, I've been always addicted to a black hole. Is what I know, you know. So it's kind of like difficult because when it comes, it's that response that I want to consume, and I try to do everything as much as possible just to see it and not identify with it. I used to identify because it was easy and it was exquisite at some point for the ego, right? But now that I have more tools in order just to see it, sometimes it's a little bit exhausting because I get into the state of anger, or not much fear, but anger is what it's been coming a lot. And I have to live with it all day, like holding it or...
But who are you angry at? But that self does not exist. That anger is what keeps it alive.
And psychological situations that I know that it's not worth it.
That's right.
It's the thing that I know what I am, and it's beautiful, and I accept it. It's just that it's exhausting.
But see, you don't accept it. Anger means you don't accept it. There's not an unconditional acceptance. And there can't be. The ego cannot unconditionally accept reality. It has to fight it. It has to be angry at oneself. And that's what keeps your ego alive. You haven't gone into the black hole yet. The black hole is there, but it's there as an other. It's there as a threat. You have to die into it, and then your anger dies, and your ego dies, and the blackness dies as well. But you haven't made that final leap into it in order for you to disappear as an ego.
There's a big yearning for that. There's a big wish to...
Yeah, there's a wish. But wishes put things off to the future. I wish I would be liberated. One day, maybe. Sure.
It's more that I wish I could do the right thing.
Yeah, don't wish it, just do it.
I tried, but...
No, don't try. That means you cry. No, it's not about trying. No.
Okay, I'll do better.
No, you can't do anything. That I is the I thought that must die into the emptiness.
I'll rest in peace.
Okay. So will I. Kalyan.
Thank you for tonight's class. I really got a lot out of it. And I guess I never considered, I see the ways that I'm always running away, keeping busy or staying tired or whatever. You know, there's a very long list that we all have. I never considered it as something, or never like saw myself as being lonely, probably because I've never allowed myself to feel lonely. Right? That's the whole point of running away from these things. So I really appreciated this concept a lot. And what it makes me think about, and what I want to ask about, is wanting to be alone. I know there's different type of structures that one would want to be either antisocial or just want to be alone and quiet. There's many reasons why someone would be alone, but I find myself often wanting to be alone for different reasons.
But for different reasons is the question. What are you doing when you're alone? Are you going online? Are you in a fantasy structure? Right? Is there still the running away from yourself even in that aloneness?
Yes. But, okay. Absolutely. So that's most of the reasons, you could say. But there's also, I think about like some of the, let's say, I would feel more sattvic reasons of being alone. And one example comes to mind is like just going and being with the trees, pruning. I'm not like, I don't feel like I'm running my mind and I'm pruning, and I'm just, it's pretty silent. And that's another reason of being alone, and I really enjoy that.
That's the value of karma yoga, by the way. I do think that when you're serving God in some way, or serving something larger than your ego, that brings you into a more exalted state. And there's more peace and freedom from the loneliness, because by the very fact that you're serving, by working, you're not alone. You're with a community, you're with God, you're with the world, with nature. Your alienation is somewhat tempered by just that action. So that's all very good. But you have to get beyond even needing that as a prop in order to make you feel okay. Right?
Thank you.
But I think you're on the right track. And it really is the silencing of the mind, the emptying out of all thought, that will enable you to know what emptiness is, what death is, and what that state of fearlessness is, that enables you then to face life with full aliveness without any trace of loneliness left. And that's when your creative intelligence will really awaken and activate. This is the reason for human culture, for the development of the arts. It's always lonely people who become artists, right? And they're tortured artists. And they paint or they write or they somehow create an image of that lonely being, but it goes through all of its permutations and is able to evolve and die in that representational mode. And so all of the fragments, like Tolstoy put all of his fragments into his novels, and then killed them off, and then in the end there's the final realization of the triumph over death and all of that. Well, you can do a lot through creativity. And it doesn't have to be writing a novel. It can be pruning trees, and it can be other things. Everything is an art if you do it with the right attitude. Every moment is a moment in which the artistry of your presence can make each thing you're doing infinitely precious. And that then enables your life to come fully alive and become divinized. But it has to be done in the solitude of egoless presence. And that's what frees you.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Vajra.
Thank you. This teaching is really making me reflect because in my mind I like to be alone and I like to be quiet, but very funny breakfast with my fellow yogis, I found out that I actually talk a lot and loud, and I had no idea. And it makes me wonder, do I really like to be quiet, and do I really like to be alone, and from what place is that coming from? Because very often, like Kalki was expressing, when I am alone, and even if I am in what I feel like is a silent meditation, sometimes I come out of it just super like angry or with a lot of like projections, and then I see other people and I'm in a joyous state, and the opposite also happens. I'll be in a very peaceful or meditative state, and then I'll see people and I'll all of a sudden be like, get out of my way. So I was wondering actually if the going through the dark hole, the black hole, is the same as silencing the mind. Are they the same?
Silencing the mind is the first phase of it. You actually have to kill the mind. It's not just a temporary silence, okay? Because you can be temporarily silent and happy, and then suddenly you're angry as hell, right? Because the anger was there in the subconscious ego. It's angry. You weren't loved. You were abandoned. You were done this wrong to and that wrong to, right? So the ego is going to express that, and then it's going to try to compensate with the talk and all of that and the loudness and get away from itself. So these are the rajasic and the tamasic defense mechanisms. And all of that has to die. And even the sense that you're a separate being, whether you were mistreated or well-treated, any of those fantasy fictions, you have to throw them all in the fire until you realize you never really existed at all. This is just a dream. And even the dream has to die. And that's when you become fully alive, but alive as nothing and everything.
Okay, but this silencing the mind is really hard, it feels like.
It's hard because you don't want to be alone. It's solitude. When the mind is not thinking, you're suddenly alone, and it feels very empty. Where's everybody? Let me create a thought, even if it's an angry thought. I'd rather have that than just emptiness. Once you begin to enjoy the emptiness, you will see that's where the bliss is. And then that same solitude of bliss will be there all the time. Life will be a meditation. If you are alone in your mind, you are alone everywhere. But that it is that only-ness that contains all, that sees no differences, because difference is non-different if you're indifferent to it, and you don't need it and you don't hate it. Then you're just totally there with all of the creative potencies of your being that is able to act with compassion and wisdom and love.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jose.
Thank you very much. Well, Marjivama was, you were answering the question, and you said to her that sometimes the mind says things like, oh, I shouldn't have said this to him. Mm-hmm. Oh, I messed up, I should have said another thing, you know, and these things. And so suddenly this thought came to my mind, and I said, Shunya shouldn't have said to Ashoka and to me that we're gonna make it.
Oh yeah, why not? Is that a curse? Why? Why? It took away your hopelessness. It took away your anger. It took away your ego's justified fury and refusal to grow up. Sorry. But I won't take it back. Are you angry, Ashoka? No. Oh, okay. But I'm glad you admitted it. I think that's a beautiful insight, that's what the ego does. It will twist everything. It'll twist a blessing into a curse. So, thank you for sharing that. Durga?
Is asking for an advice or what to do. So these last musics you have been playing, like this one today and the other one, like, I don't know, like it makes me literally want to kill the singers.
Or me? Maybe.
No, you know, but nothing, like, it's like they're in such misery that I need to kill them so they stop suffering.
Isn't that your own misery that you're projecting?
But it's so difficult. So the question is, do you recommend me to try to listen to these things? Because it's literally...
No, I recommend you listen to your own heart, and you'll hear the same music, and you'll have to kill your ego to stop it.
Yeah, but it's too, I mean, it's too dangerous.
Ah, yes, it is.
Because I literally, if you give me like a gun or whatever, I think I'll press at the button physically. So it is almost a physical effect. And I don't know, like literally the mind shuts off. It's like, this needs to die.
Sure, because it's triggering those feelings within you that are unbearable. Why do you think I play this horrible music? Because otherwise you're never going to bring it up from the subconscious.
So should I mean, as a practice, try to listen to this to see?
That's what meditation is for. Listen to your heart. And the first level is going to be your loneliness, your emptiness, your sadness, your terror, all of that. You got to listen to that before the really good songs come up and get played.
Oh. I want to skip that part.
No, there's no way to skip it. Sorry.
Okay.
The whole medley's got to be gone through.
Well, maybe I realize also my father couldn't stand this music, so it comes from that, but maybe. Another thing you helped me to understand in this teaching, there was a story I read once, and I could never understand why the person died. It was, it's called The Collector, maybe you know it. He will kidnap
John
women.
Fowles.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
He'll just leave them alone in a beautiful house in the countryside and wouldn't relate to them, give them food, but wouldn't do.
But he possessed them.
But he wouldn't do anything to them. Completely lonely, and they will die. But out of loneliness, now I understand it. For me, I thought, well, that's a really good thing. I want to be kidnapped by this one, but now I...
You have been.
But I can see how that can kill. I mean, listen to this music too. It's like, wow, this is horrible.
Yeah.
And so it makes me realize how far I'm still from feeling that myself.
Yeah, it's unbearable. It's the
Yeah.
last thing that we get to before we get liberation.
But why is this music so successful? I mean,
Successful?
why? Yeah, it's like
well,
how
because people would rather hear somebody else singing it than have to hear it from within.
Oh wow. Well, thank you. I'll try to listen to one and see.
Okay, good. Let me
And
know.
maybe I'll write my own.
Yeah, you could do a karaoke here of that.
That will be a torture for everyone. So. But thank you.
Thank you, Durga. Any last burning question, burning loneliness that wants to be confessed? Any other reactivity? Okay, everyone's ego is dead. You're all liberated already. How many people benefited from this class? Yeah? Okay. Well, I'm glad, whether you were silent or spoke, that you were able to process, to some extent, that loneliness, because that's the essence of the work that we have to do until we realize the only self that is and live as that which you really are. Namaste. Namaste.